People always told her that silence was where she found safety, a sanctuary that nobody could violate. Yet, when that fateful evening arrived, and her fate was bargained away over a poker game fueled by whiskey, her silence proved powerless to prevent what was destined to unfold. She remained positioned near the gaming table, her gaze fixed downward, fingers clasped together, breathing measured and controlled. The men carried on their conversation as though she had simply ceased to exist. That was precisely where the peril lay. Whenever people convinced themselves she couldn't perceive their words, they'd carelessly forget just how devastating the truth could sound when spoken aloud. Meanwhile, there was a man observing everything from the darkened corners of the room, and he was mere moments away from altering the course of her entire existence, though he couldn't quite articulate why he felt compelled to do so. The ornate grandfather clock standing inside the Gilded Spur saloon chimed its 10th hour. A haze of tobacco smoke lingered beneath the oil lamps, creating a thick, acrid atmosphere that seemed to adhere to every surface. Cheyenne had become a gathering place for men of this particular variety, desperate souls consumed by rage, each one searching for something they could claim as their own. Over at the table in the far corner, an intoxicated man, who went by the name Calvin Mercer, brought his palm crashing down onto the felt surface with considerable force. The impact sent poker chips that didn't belong to him scattering in every direction. Fear made his voice crack and rise in volume, a terror he attempted unsuccessfully to drown in alcohol. Sitting directly across from him was Silas Orr, a man whose business was collecting debts and whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He reclined in his chair with the calm, patient demeanor of a snake concealed in tall prairie grass. $400, Silas stated flatly. Either you settle this debt right now, or you won't be walking out of here tonight. In a desperate move, Calvin grabbed hold of the young woman standing beside him and shoved her forward roughly. Her name's Ruthie, he managed to slur out. She's plenty strong and capable, handles all the cooking and cleaning without ever talking back. In fact, she can't talk back. The girl's been deaf since birth, always has been. An uncomfortable tension rippled through the gathered crowd, yet nobody made any move to intervene. Out here in Wyoming territory, showing mercy was a gamble that few men were willing to take. Silas reached out and gripped her chin forcefully, tilting her face upward toward his own. Her eyes were a pale shade of blue, appearing vacant and unfocused, as if she were staring at something that existed far beyond his presence. A harsh laugh escaped from his lips. Then the scraping sound of a chair being pushed back cut through the tension. From the shadows emerged Jonah Hail, rising to his full height. He wasn't particularly large in stature, but the way he carried himself suggested a man who understood exactly what he was capable of accomplishing. At 34 years of age, he'd become the owner of Coldwater Ridge, a vast expanse of land that people discussed only in hushed, reverent tones. His trips into town occurred just once monthly, and he never lingered longer than absolutely necessary. Tonight, however, the approaching storm had different intentions for him. 500, Jonah announced, placing a substantial leather pouch onto the table with deliberate purpose. 400 to clear his debt. An extra 100 to ensure she never has to lay eyes on this miserable place again. The gold coins struck the felt surface with a sound so definitive it silenced every conversation in the room. Calvin's hands shot out, snatching up the pouch greedily. She's all yours then. No refunds, no returns. Jonah didn't spare him even a glance. Instead, his attention remained fixed on Silas. Step away from her, he commanded. Silas spat onto the floor, then retreated backward. Enjoy all that wonderful quiet, Hail, he sneered mockingly. Jonah turned his attention to the girl and took hold of her arm, his grip firm, yet careful, mindful not to cause harm. Let's go, he said simply. She followed him out into the pouring rain without uttering a single word. Jonah kept telling himself this was an act of rescue, not a transaction of purchase. What he didn't realize was that she had heard absolutely everything. Every clink of the coins, every threatening word, every syllable that had left his mouth. And this fundamental misunderstanding would eventually cost them both dearly. The journey back to Coldwater Ridge proved to be slow and brutally punishing. The relentless rain transformed the trail into slick, treacherous mud, and the wagon groaned in protest with every rut and hole it encountered. Jonah sat rigidly on the driver's bench, the reins gripped tightly in his calloused hands, his hat brim pulled low in a futile attempt to shield himself from the wind. Beside him sat Ruthie, her body wrapped in a wool blanket he'd tossed across her shoulders moments after they'd departed. Her gaze remained fixed straight ahead, her face an empty mask, her body perfectly motionless. Inside her mind, though, her thoughts were anything but quiet. $500. That was the precise value that had been placed on her entire life. She forced down the nausea rising in her throat and concentrated on keeping her breathing even and controlled. Silence had been her salvation before, on countless occasions. Now, it would have to save her once again. Jonah muttered a curse directed at the rain, his voice barely audible above the storm. He glanced sideways at her, carefully watching for any indication of a reaction. Her expression didn't change by even the slightest degree. Satisfied with what he perceived as confirmation, he returned his attention to the muddy road ahead. Crazy thing to do, he whispered to himself, his words meant for his ears alone. Bringing a girl like that back home with me. Martha's going to absolutely skin me alive for this. Ruthie caught the name he'd mentioned and filed it away carefully in her memory. Names always mattered. They were pieces of information worth collecting. Coldwater Ridge emerged from the darkness ahead like some kind of fortress rising from the earth. Even in the dead of night, the main house loomed impressively large against the sky, with warm lantern light glowing invitingly from its windows. Jonah brought the wagon to a halt at the porch and jumped down from the bench. He reached upward and gestured to her, his movements deliberate and slow, in the way people often moved when they believed words were completely useless. Ruthie accepted his outstretched hand. His palm was rough and warm against hers, and the unexpected gentleness of the touch surprised her more than the cold rain had. The front door swung open, and an older woman stepped out onto the porch carrying a lantern. Her hair had turned gray with age, but her posture remained sharp and alert. "Jonah Hail," she said with clear disapproval. "You're late." Then her gaze shifted and landed on Ruthie. "And just who is this you've brought with you?" Jonah's answer came simply and directly. "I couldn't leave her behind in town. The girl is deaf." Ruthie watched as the woman's face immediately softened with sympathy. "Poor thing," she murmured with genuine concern. "Get yourselves inside before you both freeze to death out here." The interior of the house radiated warmth, filled with the comforting sense of pine and simmering stew, cleaner and more welcoming than any place Ruthie had ever known in her life. Jonah shrugged out of his wet coat with practiced ease. "Get her dried off, Martha. Put her in the guest room upstairs. The one that has the lock on it." The words struck Ruthie with unexpected force. A lock. Her chest tightened involuntarily, but she maintained her blank expression perfectly. Martha guided her toward the fireplace, bustling about with towels and warm water. Ruthie followed the woman's lips carefully, nodding at the appropriate moments, playing the part she had learned to perform far too well over the years. When Jonah returned from tending to the horses in the barn, he made his way to the fire, assuming Ruthie had already gone upstairs to her room. She had not. Instead, she stood concealed in the hallway shadows, listening intently to every word. "Did you check the saddlebags like I asked?" Jonah inquired quietly. "I did," Martha confirmed. "The letter from Judge Whitem was exactly where you said it would be. He says the timing has changed unexpectedly." Ruthie's entire body went rigid. If the syndicate discovers anything about the water rights, Jonah continued, his voice low and serious, they'll burn us out without hesitation. Let them try, Martha replied with defiant confidence. Ruthie slipped away then, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. This wasn't simply a ranch she'd been brought to. This was a battlefield. And Jonah Hail had absolutely no idea what kind of complication he had just brought home with him. Ruthie closed the guest room door as softly as possible and slid the bolt into place. The sound it made was solid and final, somehow reassuring. She leaned her back against the wooden door and released the breath she'd been holding ever since they'd left the saloon. The room was small, but impeccably clean, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the dark, sweeping expanse of land beyond. It felt strange to be somewhere that smelled of soap and cleanliness instead of rot and decay. Even stranger was being given a lock that was meant to keep danger out rather than trap her inside. She crossed the room and noticed a scrap of paper resting on the nightstand, half folded in a careless manner. She smoothed it open carefully. It was a telegram receipt addressed to Jonah Hail from someone named Marshall Boone. The message was brief and chilling. They know about the girl. Move her. The date stamped on it was from yesterday. Her stomach went cold with realization. Jonah Hail hadn't acted on some noble impulse in the saloon after all. He had known she was there. He had been looking for her. She folded the paper back up and concealed it inside her bodice, her hands remaining steady despite the tremor that ran through her chest. Outside, rain continued its whispered conversation against the glass window pane. She stepped closer to the window and looked down. Below, near the barn, Jonah stood striking a match against something. The brief flare of light illuminated his face as he lit a cigarette. He looked upward suddenly. For just a moment, his gaze seemed to land directly on her window. Ruthie stepped backward into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. He wasn't just some lonely rancher trying to do a good deed. And now, neither was she simply what she pretended to be. Morning arrived clear and sharp, with sunlight burning away the mist that hung over the fields and turning the entire landscape golden. Ruthie lay perfectly still in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the hidden telegram pressing against her ribs like a weight. She dressed herself in the clean blue dress that Martha had thoughtfully left for her. She braided her hair with practiced fingers, and then studied herself in the mirror, practicing the empty expression she needed to maintain. Calm eyes that revealed nothing, no reaction to anything, completely invisible. Downstairs, the kitchen was alive with sound and movement. Martha worked dough on the counter with strong, rhythmic motions. Jonah sat at the table with his coffee and a leather-bound ledger spread before him. When Ruthie entered the room, he glanced up and something shifted in his expression before he managed to catch himself. He tapped the table surface, motioning for her to take a seat. She ate slowly and carefully, all the while listening intently to every word spoken. "The north fence has been cut again," Jonah announced with frustration. "That's the third time just this week." "They're testing you," Martha replied knowingly. "They think I'll eventually give in to their pressure," Jonah said, closing the ledger with more force than necessary. He looked directly at Ruthie. "Now I've got her safety to worry about on top of everything else." "She's safer here than anywhere else," Martha insisted. "Is she really?" Jonah stood abruptly and began pacing. If Callahan manages to find out who she really is, who her mother was, the entire game changes completely. Ruthie's fork paused for just a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible hesitation. Jonah stopped directly behind her chair. His hand hovered uncertainly in the air, then settled gently on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Ruthie," he said softly, his voice filled with genuine regret. "You deserve so much better than all of this." He left the room without speaking another word. Ruthie swallowed hard against the tightness in her throat. She wasn't just hiding out in his house for temporary shelter. She was standing at the very center of a storm that had been built on land disputes, water rights, and blood. And Jonah Hail still believed with complete certainty that she couldn't hear the danger coming. The afternoon dragged on in a heavy, oppressive quiet. Clouds gathered over Coldwater Ridge, stacking dark and low against the horizon, as if the sky itself were carefully weighing its options for what came next. Ruthie worked wherever Martha directed her. At the moment, she was dusting shelves in the long library that branched off from the main hall. The room surprised her considerably. Leather-bound books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, volumes on law and history, maps that had been carefully folded and marked with notations. This wasn't the personal collection of a brute or a simple rancher. This was the library of a man who planned meticulously and waited patiently for the right moment. She didn't hear Jonah enter the room, or rather, she pretended expertly not to notice his arrival. She sensed his presence before she actually saw him, the way the very air in the room seemed to tighten and change. He stood framed in the doorway, simply watching her. Dust clung to his boots, his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and his face appeared drawn with deep fatigue. He crossed over to the piano positioned in the corner and lifted away the cloth that protected it. The wood beneath shone dark and beautifully maintained, clearly cared for. Jonah sat down on the bench, then looked directly at her and pointed to his own ears while shaking his head, the familiar signal that meant she supposedly couldn't hear what would follow. "You cannot hear this," his gestures seemed to say. Then he began to play. The music that emerged was slow and deep, absolutely full of ache. Not some cheerful saloon tune, but something much older and infinitely sadder. The notes filled the entire room and pressed against Ruthie's chest, pulling up memories she had deliberately buried deep. Jonah's hands moved across the keys with a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with the scars that marked them. "I used to play this particular piece for my wife," he said softly, his words floating into the music. "Before the fire took everything. She always liked the sad parts best, said they felt the most honest." He stopped playing abruptly and looked directly at her with an expression of profound sadness. "I know you can't hear me, Ruthie. Maybe that's actually a mercy. If you knew what I've done to keep this land, what I've had to become, you'd run as far from here as possible." He stood and stepped closer to where she worked. The space between them narrowed significantly. He reached up slowly and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with remarkable care. The touch was gentle, almost reverent in its delicacy. "God help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't want you to run from here. I don't want you to leave." For one terrible, dangerous second, Ruthie nearly leaned into his hand, nearly allowed herself to break the silence she had worn like protective armor for so many years. The sound of hooves thundering outside shattered the moment completely. Jonah stiffened, all the softness vanishing from his expression in an instant. "Stay right here," he ordered, forgetting entirely to sign the command as he drew his revolver and strode purposefully from the room. Ruthie slipped quickly into the hall and eased the parlor window open, just enough to hear what was happening outside. 3 riders had pulled up in front of the house. The man positioned in front wore a gray suit that looked far too clean and expensive for this harsh land. Lucas Callahan. His voice carried clearly, smooth, and sharp like a well-honed blade. "Final offer, Hail. Sell us the water rights and this ends peacefully." "They're not for sale," Jonah replied flatly. "Then let me see the girl they're talking about." Jonah's gun clicked back with an ominous sound. Ruthie's pulse began racing frantically. One of the mounted men shifted slightly in his saddle, his hand drifting casually toward his holster. Jonah's focus remained locked entirely on Callahan. He wouldn't see the threat developing in time. Ruthie grabbed the porcelain vase from the table beside her and hurled it straight through the window with all her strength. Glass exploded outward in a shower of glittering fragments. The horses reared up in panic. In the sudden chaos, Jonah fired. The bullet snapped a hat clean off one man's head, sending it spinning. "The next one won't miss its target," Jonah roared with absolute conviction. Callahan cursed violently and wheeled his horse away, shouting threats back over his shoulder as the three riders fled down the road. Jonah stormed back inside immediately and seized Ruthie by both shoulders, his grip tight with fear and anger. "What were you thinking doing something like that?" She pointed down at the floor near her feet and mimed swatting at something. A desperate lie about killing a bug. Jonah studied her face intently, his eyes sharp and searching for any crack in her facade. "That noise you made saved my life just now," he said quietly, his voice filled with suspicion and wonder. "Lucky timing, I suppose." As he turned away from her, his voice carried back across the room. "I'm going to find out the truth about you, Ruthie, one way or another." She sank slowly to the floor among the scattered shards of broken glass. She had saved his life without question, and in doing so, she had drawn his suspicion closer to her than it had ever been before. The days that followed were stretched tight with mounting strain. Coldwater Ridge felt smaller with each passing hour. Its wide halls seemed to fill with an unspoken watchfulness that pressed in from all sides. Jonah's eyes followed Ruthie everywhere she went. At the table during meals, on the porch when she took air, by the fire at night when they sat in silence. He said very little during this time, but the silence that existed between them was no longer gentle or comfortable. It pressed in from all sides, sharp and alert like a blade that had been drawn and was waiting to cut. Ruthie felt it constantly, this new awareness. She kept her movements slow and seemingly careless, her gaze perpetually unfocused, her body loose, as if nothing ever reached her consciousness. It was exhausting work maintaining this performance. One single mistake would undo everything she had built. She had learned long ago that survival meant becoming exactly what other people expected to see when they looked at you. On the third evening after the confrontation, Martha was sent into town to stay with her sister. Jonah refused to have her caught in the middle of whatever violence was coming their way. When the wagon disappeared down the long road, the house fell into an even deeper quiet than before. Wind rattled against the windows insistently. Firelight filled the study with constantly shifting shadows. Jonah sat in his leather chair with a glass of whiskey in hand. Ruthie knelt on the rug before the fire, carefully mending a tear in one of his work shirts. She could feel his stare on her like physical heat against her back. "It's quiet tonight," Jonah said in a perfectly normal voice, not bothering to sign. "Too quiet, really." Ruthie didn't look up from her work. She pushed the needle through the cloth, counting each stitch silently to maintain her focus. "I've been thinking about your father, Calvin," Jonah continued conversationally. "I found out where he's been staying in town." He leaned forward in his chair. "I sent a man to deal with him properly. He won't see tomorrow's sunrise." The words cut deep into Ruthie's heart. Her chest burned with the effort of remaining silent. Every part of her wanted to cry out, to plead for mercy, to shatter the lie she'd been living, but she forced her hands to keep moving steadily. One stitch, then another, maintaining the rhythm. Her face stayed perfectly calm, revealing nothing. Jonah watched her for a long, painfully tense moment. Then his shoulders sagged with something like defeat. "God," he muttered to himself. "You really can't hear a single word I'm saying, can you?" He rose from his chair and poured the remaining whiskey directly into the fire. The flames flared up bright and angry. "I'm losing my mind," he said to the empty room, "seeing enemies and deception everywhere I look." He knelt down beside her on the rug, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "I didn't just buy you because of the land and the water rights, Ruthie. The truth is, I've been alone for far too long. Silence used to be my only friend, the only thing I could trust. Now I hate it because it keeps me from ever hearing your voice, from knowing what you think." His hand closed around hers, warm and steady and achingly gentle. Ruthie's breath caught involuntarily in her throat. She found herself leaning toward him, just slightly, drawn by something she couldn't name. A tremendous crash sounded from the direction of the kitchen. Fire bloomed suddenly in the hallway, spreading with terrifying speed. Thick smoke rolled fast through the house. "They're burning us out!" Jonah shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of flames. He dragged her forcefully toward the stairs, as intense heat roared up behind them, consuming everything in its path. Upstairs, he forced the window open with desperate strength. "Jump!" he urged, miming the motion frantically when she seemed to hesitate. She leaped out onto the porch roof without hesitation. Jonah followed immediately behind her. Below them, men laughed cruelly in the darkness. Gunfire cracked through the night air. Jonah returned fire, covering her escape as best he could. The roof began to collapse beneath them with a horrible groaning sound. Ruthie ran desperately for the barn. Behind her, Jonah vanished completely into the smoke and flame. "Jonah!" she screamed with everything she had. The word tore itself free from her throat before she could stop it, before she could think about what it meant. The shout echoed once across the burning yard and was immediately swallowed by the sounds of fire and gunshots. Ruthie didn't stop running. She tore across the open yard toward the barn, her boots slipping treacherously in the mud, smoke clawing painfully at her lungs with every gasping breath. Behind her, the porch roof gave way completely with a deafening roar, sending sparks bursting up into the night sky like angry fireflies. For one terrible, endless heartbeat, she genuinely believed Jonah was gone forever. Then a dark shape broke free from the wall of smoke. Jonah staggered out into the open air, his coat actively smoldering, one leg dragging behind him awkwardly. Bullets snapped into the dirt at his heels as he sprinted for safety. He dove through the barn doors, just as they slammed shut under a hail of shots. Wood splintered and cracked. Inside the stalls, the horses screamed and reared up in terror. "Saddle the black one," Jonah rasped urgently, blood running down the side of his face in a dark stream. "Do it now!" Ruthie didn't wait for signs or gestures or anything else. She threw the heavy saddle onto Midnight's broad back and cinched it tight with flying hands, her movements practiced and swift from years of experience. Jonah watched her work with a flicker of something like shock crossing his features, but there was absolutely no time to speak or question. The barn door shuddered again under the impact of bullets. Smoke began curling in through the cracks between the boards. "Get on," he ordered sharply. She swung herself up into the saddle and Jonah mounted behind her, his arms closing around her body to grab the reins. "Hold tight," he growled directly into her ear. Midnight charged forward with explosive power. The barn doors burst open in a storm of splinters and flame. They tore out into the night together, a single black shadow racing against the backdrop of the burning house. Shots rang out behind them, wild and panicked in their aim. The ridge itself seemed to swallow them whole as Midnight climbed higher and higher. His hooves struck stone with ringing impacts, breath tearing from his lungs in great heaving gasps. They rode without stopping until the glow of Coldwater Ridge was nothing but a dying ember against the vast field of stars above. Jonah didn't slow the horse's pace until the trail narrowed dangerously into steep switchbacks where any pursuit would be absolute suicide. Wind cut through Ruthie's thin dress like knives. She felt the intense heat of Jonah's body pressed close against her back, felt the wet warmth soaking steadily into her shoulder from his wound. He's hurt badly. Near dawn, Midnight finally stumbled onto a narrow shelf of land tucked beneath a hanging rock formation known locally as Devil's Pulpit. Jonah slid down from the saddle and nearly collapsed completely. Ruthie caught him, guiding his weight beneath the sheltering stone, as rain began falling again, light and cold against their skin. "I'm fine," he muttered unconvincingly, sinking heavily to the ground. "It's just a scratch. Nothing serious." It was a complete lie. Blood had darkened his entire side. Ruthie moved without conscious thought, striking flint with practiced hands, coaxing a small shielded fire to life in the shelter of the rocks. She tore strips of fabric from her dress and cleaned the wound with shaking hands, working as carefully as she could. "You're surprisingly good at this," Jonah whispered, watching her face intently. "Didn't take you for someone who'd know field medicine." She ignored his words completely, wrapping the bandage tight around his torso. The night grew progressively colder around them. She curled her body against his, sharing what warmth she had, listening to his breathing gradually ease as exhaustion finally claimed him. When dawn painted the canyon walls in brilliant shades of red and violet, Jonah stirred back to consciousness. "They'll track us," he said hoarsely, stating the obvious. "We're going to need water soon." Ruthie stood without a word and pointed down into the ravine below them. She took his revolver from where it lay and slipped away silently toward the sound of running water somewhere in the distance. Her heart pounded as she moved. A twig snapped sharply behind her. "Well, now," a voice sneered from too close. "Look what we have here. The little mute bird, all alone." Ruthie turned slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. The scarred man leveled his rifle directly at her chest with casual confidence. Her fingers tightened around the hidden gun. Silence had kept her alive for years. Now it might be the thing that finally killed her. The man stepped closer, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. Ruthie could smell him now, the acrid scent of sweat mixed with tobacco and old, festering anger. He grinned at her like he already owned her, like she was a prize he'd just won. "Where's Hail hiding?" he asked mockingly. "Tell me where he is, and maybe I'll let you walk away from this." Then he laughed at his own cruel joke. "Oh, that's right. I forgot. You can't answer me, can you?" Ruthie's heart hammered so violently, she feared the sound might somehow give her away. She allowed the canteen to slip from her fingers deliberately. It hit the rocks with a dull thud that echoed slightly. The man lowered the rifle just enough to leer at her more directly. "Come here, girl," he commanded. He had moved too close now, far too close for his own good. If she fired the gun, the sound would carry and echo through the entire canyon. Others would come running. Jonah would be trapped and helpless. Her mind raced frantically, measuring distance, calculating breath, considering timing. She looked past the man's shoulder with a convincing expression of fear. "Behind you," she said clearly. The words came out rough and unused after so long, but they were perfectly clear and understandable. The man froze completely. His eyes widened in genuine shock as he turned his head without thinking, instinct overriding reason. In that single instant of distraction, Ruthie swung the heavy revolver like a hammer. The solid barrel cracked against his temple with a sickening sound. He dropped to the ground without making another sound, folding into the dirt like a puppet with its strings cut. Ruthie stood over his motionless form, her chest heaving with exertion and fear. She had spoken aloud. The lie she had worn like a second skin for so many years was broken irreparably now. She moved with urgent efficiency. She took his knife from his belt, collected his extra ammunition, and then dragged his unconscious body into the thick brush, hiding it beneath branches and loose stone where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Then she ran back up the ravine as fast as her legs would carry her, breath burning in her lungs, fear driving every step. Jonah was sitting upright when she reached the shelter. Relief flickered visibly across his face, followed immediately by confusion. "I thought I heard someone down there," he said carefully, a voice calling out. She handed him the full canteen without speaking. Her hand shook noticeably. She couldn't pretend anymore. Not after the fire that had consumed his home. Not after all the blood that had been spilled. She sat down across from him and drew a breath that felt like tearing something loose deep inside her chest. Jonah. The sound of his name, spoken in her voice, stopped him completely cold. He stared at her, as if the entire world had suddenly shifted beneath his feet without warning. "You can speak," he whispered in disbelief. "I can hear," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I always have been able to hear everything." The truth spilled out of her in halting words that came faster as she continued. She told him about the map, about the judge, about the water rights that were legally hers, about the childhood that had been stolen from her. "Calvin Mercer wasn't my father," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He took me when I was just a child. I'm the rightful heir. Rosewater Creek belongs to me by law." Jonah pulled away from her slightly, hurt flashing visibly into anger across his features. "You lied to me this entire time," he said accusingly. "Yes," she admitted, without trying to justify it. "I lied to survive. That's what I had to do." For a long, tense moment, nothing but the wind made any sound between them. Then Jonah reached for her hand, gripping it tightly in his own. "Callahan will come," he said with grim certainty. "And when he does, we finish this once and for all." They made the conscious decision not to run anymore. Instead, they became the hunters. Ruthie climbed high up into the canyon rocks, using the natural echo of the stone walls to her strategic advantage. "Help me!" she cried out, her voice carrying and breaking apart against the rock formations. "Someone please help!" The men below scattered in confusion, unable to pinpoint where the sound was actually coming from. Jonah struck from shadow and stone, his movements precise and absolutely merciless in their efficiency. When only Lucas Callahan remained, cornered by the creek with nowhere left to run, Ruthie stepped forward into the open. "I'm not mute," she said clearly, letting him see the truth. "And I'm not selling what's rightfully mine." Callahan's gun dropped from his hand into the mud. 6 months later, snow fell gently over Coldwater Ridge. The new house stood strong and solid against the winter sky. Jonah and Ruthie stood together on the porch, watching the valley spread out before them in quiet, hard-won peace. For the first time in either of their lives, silence wasn't empty or fearful. It had finally become home. Winter settled over Coldwater Ridge slowly and gently, like a careful hand being laid on a wound that was finally beginning to heal. Snow filled in the scars that the fire had left behind, smoothing over blackened earth and broken stone with patient care. Ruthie watched it fall from the porch of the half-built house, wrapped securely in a thick shawl that smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. Each morning brought the same quiet, steady work, carrying water from the well, sorting nails by size, holding boards steady, while Jonah set them carefully in place. Nothing was rushed or hurried. Nothing was wasted or careless. They spoke more frequently now than before, not in long, elaborate speeches, not in confessions meant to impress or convince, just simple words shared naturally between tasks that needed doing. Jonah would ask for her opinion on something, and then actually wait for her answer. Ruthie would answer honestly, without any fear of being heard or judged. Sometimes she would laugh, genuinely surprised by the sound of her own laughter. Sometimes she would fall silent again, not out of hiding or fear, but simply by choice. At night, they would sit together by the fire that burned clean and steady in the hearth. Jonah would hand her a book from the small collection that had miraculously survived the flames, and she would read aloud until his eyes gradually closed with contentment. He liked the sound of her voice, especially when the actual words didn't particularly matter. There were still moments when the past would rise up sharp and sudden, a particular smell of smoke on the wind, a sound like breaking glass in the distance. When that happened, Jonah would go completely still, his jaw tightening visibly. Ruthie had learned to wait patiently during these moments, to sit close without touching until he managed to come back to himself. He had learned to breathe through the memories, to let them pass, without turning them into anger or violence. Trust didn't arrive all at once in some grand gesture. It grew gradually in small, ordinary ways that accumulated over time. Jonah leaving his gun on the table when he stepped outside to work. Ruthie walking alone down to the ridge without constantly looking over her shoulder. Each small act said the same fundamental thing. I believe you. I trust you. One evening, as the sky turned pale pink and gold with sunset, Jonah set down his hammer and leaned against the porch rail thoughtfully. I keep thinking about that first night, he said quietly. How close I came to losing absolutely everything that mattered. Ruthie nodded in understanding. So did I, she admitted. He looked at her then. Really looked. Not as a problem that needed solving, not as a secret that required guarding, but as a woman who had consciously chosen to stay. I won't ask you to forget, he said carefully, what you were forced to do to survive. She stepped closer to him. I won't ask you to forget either. The wind carried the sounds of the valley below to them, cattle lowing in the distance, the creek moving steadily over smooth stone, life continuing and renewing itself. Jonah reached for her hand slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted. She did not pull away. Their fingers fit together easily and naturally, like they had always known exactly what shape they were meant to hold. Silence settled around them once again. Not the heavy, oppressive kind, not the dangerous kind that hid threats. Just quiet. And for the first time in either of their lives, neither of them was afraid of what it meant. Spring came late to Coldwater Ridge that year. Snow lingered stubbornly in the shadows, while the sun worked patiently at the edges, slowly melting paths through the frozen land. Ruthie noticed the change first in the creek, how it ran fuller and clearer with each passing day, its voice growing steady and sure and honest. She stood at the bank one morning and listened, really listened to the sound that had shaped so much blood and greed and violence. Now, it sounded like nothing but promise and possibility. Jonah rode out most days to check the outer fences and inspect the high trails. He deliberately took longer routes than strictly necessary, testing the ground carefully, making absolutely certain no one was watching or waiting. Ruthie understood his caution perfectly. Danger didn't simply vanish just because winter had passed. Men like Callahan were patient. They always waited for another opportunity. Still, Jonah returned faithfully each evening with dust on his boots and eyes lighter than they had been in years. One afternoon, a rider came slowly up the drive carrying official papers, sealed with red wax. Ruthie watched from the porch as Jonah dismounted and accepted the envelope. He didn't open it right away with eager hands. Instead, he came inside, set it deliberately on the table, and looked directly at her. It's from Judge Wyoming, he said simply. The final ruling. Her stomach tightened involuntarily. She nodded and waited, barely breathing. The papers confirmed exactly what they already knew in their hearts. The legal claim to Rosewater Creek belonged to Ruthie, fully and completely. The syndicate's reach had been broken permanently. Any attempt to challenge the ruling would bring immediate federal attention that they absolutely could not afford to attract. Jonah exhaled slowly, like a man finally setting down a heavy load he'd carried far too long. It's over, he said with relief. Ruthie touched the edge of the table, grounding herself in the moment. No, she said gently, correcting him. It's finished. There's a difference. The distinction between those words mattered deeply to both of them. That night, Jonah cooked supper himself without any assistance. The meal was simple and uneven in places, but Ruthie smiled genuinely and ate every single bite. They talked about small things throughout the evening, where to plant new trees in spring, which pasture to rest and let recover, the kind of talk that built a shared future without needing to name it explicitly. Later, They walked the ridge together under a sky absolutely crowded with brilliant stars. Jonah stopped near the place where the old house had once stood proudly. Charred stones still marked the ground like grave markers. "I thought I lost my entire life here," he said quietly, his voice thick with remembered pain. "You lost a house," Ruthie replied with gentle firmness. "Not your life. There's a difference." He turned to face her then, the question clear in his eyes, even though he left it unspoken. She answered by stepping closer and resting her head against his chest. His arms came around her, steady and sure and protective. They stood that way for a long time, simply listening to the night surrounding them. Wind moving through grass, water flowing far below in the darkness. No threats lurking, no secrets hiding, just truth finally spoken aloud and accepted. The weeks that followed settled naturally into a rhythm that felt earned, rather than lucky. Spring pushed harder now, with green climbing determinedly up the hills, where ash had once clung stubbornly. Ruthie took charge of managing the creek records with a calm confidence that surprised even her. She met personally with neighboring ranchers who came up the ridge one by one, hats held respectfully in hand, voices cautious at first. When she spoke to them, they listened carefully. Not because she raised her voice or made threats, but because she didn't have to do either. Jonah watched from a careful distance the first time this happened. He leaned casually against the fence rail, arms crossed loosely, eyes alert for any sign of trouble. He observed how she held herself with quiet authority, how she answered their questions plainly and directly, how she didn't flinch even slightly when the men tested her knowledge or resolve. When the meeting finally ended, the ranchers rode off considerably quieter than they had arrived. Jonah smiled to himself and said nothing at all. That evening, Ruthie found him in the barn carefully rubbing down midnight after a long ride. "You didn't step in to help," she observed. "You didn't need me to," Jonah replied simply. He met her gaze steadily. "You never actually did." They shared supper together in companionable quiet that evening. Later, Jonah pulled a folded paper from his pocket and set it on the table between them. "I wrote to the judge," he said carefully. "Asked him about transferring the old land maps to your name legally." Ruthie touched the paper lightly, but didn't pick it up to read. "You don't have to give up control of anything." "I'm not giving up control," he said gently, his voice filled with meaning. "I'm sharing it with the person who rightfully owns it." The complete honesty in his voice steadied something deep inside her. She nodded once. That simple gesture was enough communication between them. A storm rolled in suddenly after dark. Thunder echoed dramatically across the valley. Ruthie woke abruptly to the sound and sat up in bed, her heart racing. Fire still lived too close in her memory, too immediate and real. Before fear could properly root itself, Jonah was already there beside the bed, kneeling close, his hand warm and reassuring around hers. "It's just rain," he said softly. "Nothing more. I've got you safe." She believed him without question. In the morning, they walked the land together, their boots sinking into soft earth that smelled rich and alive. Jonah showed her where he planned to rebuild the barn, stronger this time and better designed. She showed him where the creek bent just enough to make it easier for the cattle to cross through during the hot summer months. Their plans braided together naturally, without any effort or negotiation. At the ridge's edge, Ruthie stopped walking and turned to face him. "There's something I haven't said to you," she told him honestly. "I don't want silence to be my armor anymore, but sometimes I still need it, just for myself." Jonah nodded with complete understanding. "Then we'll keep it sacred when you need it," he promised, "and we'll break it when you don't." She reached for his hand without hesitation. He took it immediately, his grip warm and sure. The valley breathed peacefully around them, wide and patient and full of possibility. No one spoke for several moments. No one needed to speak. The quiet held them both gently, not as a hiding place anymore, but as a promise they were learning how to keep together. Summer arrived in full force and brilliant intensity, laying heat across Coldwater Ridge like something alive and breathing. Grass stood tall again across the fields. The creek ran steady and honest, its banks firm and reliable. Ruthie rose early each morning, often before Jonah stirred, and walked the land while the world was still quiet and belonged only to her. She liked those hours best, the sound of birds gradually waking, the slow, deliberate rhythm of her own steps, silence that was chosen freely rather than forced upon her. Jonah joined her on these walks whenever he could manage it. Some mornings they walked together without speaking at all, their boots naturally finding the same comfortable pace. Other days they talked casually about nothing of particular importance: the weather patterns, fence repairs that needed doing, the way the land seemed to heal itself when given sufficient time. It felt right and earned. Word spread gradually through the valley, not as gossip or rumor, but as genuine understanding. Ranchers began coming to Ruthie directly now when disputes arose over water usage or boundaries. She listened far more than she spoke, carefully weighing each word before offering a decision or suggestion. Jonah never interrupted these meetings. He stood back with his hands resting easy at his sides, letting her lead completely. People noticed and respected the dynamic between them. One afternoon, Ruthie found Jonah working alone in the rebuilt barn. Sweat had darkened his shirt completely. She watched him work for a quiet moment before speaking. "You don't look like a man who's waiting for something to be taken from him anymore," she observed. He smiled without stopping his work. "I stopped guarding ghosts," he replied simply. She stepped closer into the barn. "And me? Do you still guard me?" Jonah set his tools down carefully and turned to face her fully. "I don't guard you," he said with absolute certainty. "I stand with you. There's a fundamental difference." The words settled between them, solid and sure as bedrock. That night they sat together on the porch as the sun sank low, painting the entire valley in deep, rich gold. Ruthie leaned against Jonah's shoulder naturally, listening to the world gradually settle itself for night. Crickets beginning their songs, wind moving through the grass, water flowing far below, all of it clear and honest and real. "I was afraid," she said quietly into the peaceful evening, "that once all the danger had passed, you'd see me differently somehow." Jonah shook his head firmly. "I see you clearly now," he said, "more clearly than I ever have." She looked up at him then, really looked with all her attention. The scars were still visible on his face and hands. So was the strength that had always been there. But the hardness that used to define him had softened into something steadier and more reliable, something that stayed. Ruthie took his hand and pressed it flat against her chest, where he could feel her heartbeat. "This is mine," she said with quiet intensity. "My voice, my life, my choices." Jonah closed his fingers gently over her hand. "And I'm not asking you to give any of it to me," he said seriously. "I'm just grateful you choose to share it." The stars emerged one by one overhead, quiet and constant in their positions. No threats rode up to the ridge that night. No dangerous shadows crept at the edges of the firelight. Just two people who had survived the absolute worst and then consciously chosen what came next. Silence settled around them again naturally, not empty, not heavy with unspoken things, complete and whole. The first snow came early that year, drifting down in soft sheets across Coldwater Ridge. It settled gently on new beams and fresh boards, turning the rebuilt house pale and quiet and beautiful. Ruthie stood on the porch with Jonah, watching the valley gradually take on its winter appearance. Clean smoke rose from the chimney. The land looked whole again, healed. Jonah rested his elbows comfortably on the porch rail, his posture easy in a way it had never been in all the years before. I used to think quiet meant empty, he said thoughtfully, like something essential was missing. Ruthie smiled and leaned closer against him. Quiet only feels empty when you're alone, she replied. They went inside as the cold deepened outside. The house held genuine warmth now, not just from the fire burning in the hearth, but from daily use and shared living. Boots stood by the door. Books were stacked where Ruthie had been reading them aloud. The table bore marks from meals shared and future plans drawn out together. It was a place that remembered them and their life together. That night, Jonah lit the lamp in the sitting room and brought out a single folded paper. He set it down without ceremony or fanfare. I had the deed updated officially, he said simply. Everything's in your name now. The creek, the ridge, all of it belongs legally to you. Ruthie looked at the paper, then directly at him. You don't have to keep proving anything to me. I'm not trying to prove anything, Jonah replied honestly. I'm choosing. There's a difference. She took the paper and tucked it away carefully. Then she reached for both his hands, grounding him the way he had learned to ground her when she needed it. Then choose this, she said softly, her meaning clear. They stood together close, listening to the wind pressing insistently against the windows outside. No fear followed it inside their home. No painful memory rose sharp enough to cut through their peace. Later, as the fire burned low and cast dancing shadows, Jonah brushed a stray lock of hair gently from her face. Tell me something, he requested. Anything at all? Ruthie thought for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice warm and steady and confident, filling the room the way light naturally fills a space that's meant for it. She told him a simple story about a girl who had learned to survive by being silent, about a man who had learned to listen without actually hearing, about a harsh land that demanded complete truth before it would consent to heal. Jonah listened to every single word, each one landing exactly where it belonged. When she finally finished, he leaned in and kissed her, slow and sure and full of promise. In that perfect moment, silence didn't rush back to fill the space. It stayed gentle and patient, like a breath being held in anticipation. Outside, snow continued to fall steadily. Inside, two lives settled completely into something lasting and real. Jonah had initially thought he was saving a helpless girl from a terrible fate. Instead, he had been saved by a woman strong enough to break her own silence when the time was right. Together, they built something neither could have possibly held alone. And on Coldwater Ridge, quiet was no longer simply a refuge from danger. It had finally become home. Now, before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching this from? What corner of the world is enjoying this frontier tale tonight? If this tale stirred something in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales from the Frontier, where history rides alongside the frontier spirit, where courage faces its ultimate test, and where love refuses to die, even in the harshest conditions. Until the next tale rides in, partner.